Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're plunging into, well, a really fascinating cultural assumption, one that's practically etched into our collective consciousness. The idea that left-handed people are inherently more creative, more artistic, maybe even a little bit more genius.
hmm It's a powerful image, isn't it?
Totally. You immediately think of brilliant sinistrals like Leonardo da Vinci, right? Famously sketching revolutionary designs with his left hand.
Or Jimi Hendrix.
Exactly. Jimi Hendrix conjuring these otherworldly sounds from his guitar, played upside down, left-handed. These figures, and honestly, countless others, they get paraded as like undeniable proof of this creative advantage.
Yeah, they become the poster children for the idea.
But is this really a genuine creative edge, a kind of superpower for the Southpaws? Or is it just another captivating cultural myth that's sort of taken on a life of its own, almost of a romantic notion we cling to?
And it gets even more intriguing when you think about the historical baggage.
Right. The very word sinister comes from the Latin for left, and its root, laevus, wasn't just descriptive, was it?
No, not at all. It carried this weight, meaning unfavorable or unpropitious, especially like when interpreting ancient omens. Bad news if it was on the left.
So, how did we flip from unfavorable to uniquely creative in the popular mind? It's a huge shift. It really begs for a closer look, doesn't it?
Definitely.
Okay, let's unpack this cultural paradox then. Our mission today is to dive deep into exactly that question, the truth behind the left-handed creative genius myth. We're drawing primarily from a really compelling piece by William L. Weaver, very aptly titled The Sinister Myth.
hmm
And that article, in turn, it's built on the bedrock of this huge scientific review and meta-analysis. It's called Handedness and Creativity, Facts and Fictions by Owen Morgan, C. Zhao, and Daniel Casasanto.
Right. And these researchers, they've really done the heavy lifting, meticulously pulling together decades of data, distilling it down. What's truly fascinating here, and what this deep dive should give you, really, is a shortcut. A shortcut to understanding this whole complex topic, separating what we think we know, the common wisdom, from what the science actually shows.
So sifting through all that evidence.
Exactly. Our mission is to sift through all that scientific evidence, evaluating years and years of studies involving thousands of participants from all over. We're looking to definitively answer two key questions. One, do left or mixed-handed individuals actually score higher on scientific tests of creativity in controlled lab settings?
Okay.
And two, are they statistically overrepresented in creative professions out there in the real world?
So getting beyond just the famous example.
Precisely. We're moving beyond anecdote and popular belief to the empirical, data-driven fact. It's a crucial distinction, and the answers might actually surprise you.
And to really get a handle on where this modern myth might even come from, to kind of appreciate the context for all this, we have to start by acknowledging that long, often negative linguistic shadow that left-handedness has cast throughout history. It's not just some historical side note. It feels pretty fundamental.
Oh, absolutely fundamental. The cultural bias against left-handedness isn't just, there. It's deeply embedded in our language itself. And his has been for centuries.
Wow.
It's not some fluke. It really shows how profoundly societal norms can shape our very vocabulary. Think about the Latin word for right, dexter.
Right, like dexterity.
Exactly. From that, we get dexterity, which immediately brings up images of skill, cleverness, adroitness. It's inherently positive, isn't it?
Yeah, totally.
Now, contrast that with the Latin word for left, sinister. We mentioned its root, laevus, didn't just mean left. It carried these connotations of being unfavorable, unpropitious, especially in things like Roman omen interpretation.
Like seeing a bird on your left was bad luck.
Precisely. If an augur saw a bird flying on their left, it was a bad sign. This linguistic framework didn't just passively reflect bias, it actively perpetuated it, reinforced this negative perception of anything associated with the left. Imagine growing up in a world where the very words used to describe your dominant hand carried such a heavy negative meaning.
It's incredible how deep that bias runs, woven into the very fabric of how we describe things. And it seems to pop up even in fields we think of as totally objective, like science. Are there other places this linguistic bias has sort of crept in?
You're spot on, even in highly objective fields like chemistry. When we talk about molecular chirality, the handedness or 3D orientation of molecules, we use terms steeped in this historical bias.
Really? How so?
Well, molecules that rotate polarized light to the right
Yep.
are labeled D for dextrorotatory,
Hmm.
and they get a plus sign, implying sort of a correct or standard rotation.
Okay.
Those that rotate light to the left are labeled L for laboratory and get a minus sign.
Ah, so right is plus, left is minus.
Exactly. It's subtle, maybe, but it's there. The right is positive, the left is negative. This framework, inherited from historical biases, subtly shapes perception, even in something as neutral as molecular structure. It just shows how deep these associations go.
So given this really long, often quite negative history, this deep-seated linguistic prejudice against left-handedness, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? How did this modern myth of the creative lefty even start? Is it possible this positive spin is a way to sort of, I don't know, balance the historical scales? Could it be a form of what some might call restorative justice, a cultural, maybe even unconscious, attempt to compensate for centuries of negativity by giving this amazing, almost mystical gift of creativity to the historically, well, maligned left-handers? Weaver raises this as a compelling editorial question.
It truly is compelling. The idea of a cultural pendulum swinging back,
Mm.
society trying to overcorrect for past wrongs, or maybe
Yeah.
just crafting a more appealing story to counter a really unpleasant one. It's a powerful way to look at it.
Hmm.
It certainly resonates with how narratives evolve over time, and it makes the scientific investigation into the actual facts, whether this perceived advantage is real, even more critical. Because if it's a form of restorative justice, that's a fascinating social thing. But if it's meant as an empirical claim, well, it needs testing.
Which brings us right to the core of our deep dive today. That big meta-analysis by Morgan, Zhao, and Casasanto, they really set out to put this widely held belief, this potent cultural story, to the most rigorous scientific test they could.
They absolutely did, with admirable scientific rigor, too. The researchers basically set out to answer two fundamental questions. First,
Yeah.
do left-handed or mixed-handed people actually score higher on those standardized scientific tests designed to measure creativity in controlled lab environments?
Okay, the lab evidence.
And second, are they statistically overrepresented in actual creative professions out in the real world?
The real-world evidence, got it.
These are direct, measurable questions designed to either confirm the popular myth or, well, debunk it.
So they weren't just looking at like one or two studies here and there or cherry-picking data that fit an idea. They were casting a really wide net.
Not at all. And that's the real strength, the genius, really, of a meta-analysis. Instead of relying on individual studies, which, can sometimes have small sample sizes or specific biases,
Right.
they systematically evaluated decades of research. They aggregated data from thousands upon thousands of participants across tons of studies, effectively combining many smaller experiments into one massive, statistically powerful investigation.
Okay, so that gives their findings a lot more weight.
Exactly.
Yeah.
This comprehensive approach provides incredibly strong scientific grounding for their findings. It lets them draw conclusions that individual studies just can't. They can identify consistent patterns across a huge amount of empirical evidence, which is absolutely essential when you're trying to definitively debunk or confirm a widespread, deeply ingrained belief like this one. It's like looking at the whole forest, not just, a few interesting trees.
So, with all that data piled up, let's talk about those laboratory tests. For those of us maybe not steeped in cognitive psychology, what exactly are these standardized creativity tests trying to measure? How do you even begin to quantify something as, well, slippery as creativity?
That's a great question because, creativity can feel so intangible, almost mystical.
Mm-hmm.
But scientists have developed some pretty ingenious ways to break it down into measurable bits. These tests mainly focus on two key types of thinking. First, there's divergent thinking. That's your ability to generate lots of possible, unusual, novel solutions to a problem. Thinking outside the box.
Okay, lots of ideas.
And then there's convergent thinking. That's more about finding the single best or most correct solution to a problem, often by making connections between things that seem unrelated.
Finding the right answer, kind of.
Sort of, or the most fitting connection. One of the most common tests for divergent thinking is the alternate uses test, or AUT. Imagine you're given a really common object, say, a brick. You're then asked to come up with as many original and unusual uses for that brick as you can in a set time, beyond, building a wall.
Right, like a doorstop, a paperweight.
Exactly. Or maybe a weapon, grinding it for pigment, using it as a step stool, maybe even carving it. Your responses get scored for a few things.
Right.
Fluency is just the total number of ideas you generate.
Got it. Quantity.
Then there's originality, which assesses how novel or unique your ideas are compared to what other people came up with. Are they really groundbreaking or just common variations?
Quality, in a sense.
Kind of. And beyond those, scores can also measure flexibility, like how many different categories do your ideas fall into? Are all your brick uses about weight, or do they branch out into tools, art, structure, and sometimes elaboration on how much detail you put into your ideas?
Okay, that makes sense. What about convergent thinking tests?
A really popular one there, which taps into both convergent and maybe a bit of divergent thinking, is the remote associates test, or RIT.
RT, okay.
Here, you get maybe 2 or 3 keywords that seem totally unrelated. Your job is to find a single target word that connects all of them.
Like a puzzle.
Exactly.
Right.
For instance, if the cues were cookies, heart, and 16, what word connects them?
Sweet. Sweet cookies, sweetheart, sweet 16.
Bingo. That's it. This test requires what psychologists call semantic leaps. You have to bridge concepts that seem far apart. Find that hidden link. It really taps into seeing connections others might miss.
Cool. Any others?
Yeah, finally, there are the Torrance tests of creative thinking, the TTCT. These are pretty comprehensive and have 2 main parts, a verbal section and a figural section. The verbal part is pretty similar to the AUT, maybe asking you to improve a product or list unusual uses for toys. The figural section, which is quite relevant here, is drawing-based.
Drawing.
Right. You might get an incomplete figure, just a curved line, say, and you have to complete it creatively, turn it into something original, and give it a title. They're scored on similar things like fluency, originality, flexibility, and elaboration, but obviously adapted for drawings.
Okay, so armed with these different tools, AUT, RAT, TTCT, and having pulled together all that data from thousands of people, what did Morgan, Zhao, and Casasanto actually find? So what does this all mean? Did the lab results confirm the creative lefty myth?
Well, the results were pretty unequivocal, actually.
Yeah.
And they directly challenged that popular belief.
Mm-hmm.
Across the board, they found essentially no evidence suggesting that left-handers, or even mixed-handers people without a strong hand preference, scored significantly higher on tests of divergent thinking.
No advantage at all.
Statistically speaking, no. Their ability to generate novel ideas, to think outside the box in these tests, was not superior to right-handers. The widely held assumption just wasn't backed up by the data from these lab tests.
Wow. Okay.
In fact, and this is where it gets really counterintuitive, might even flip your expectations. The meta-analysis revealed a slight but statistically significant right-handed edge.
Wait, right-handed, they scored higher.
Yes, you heard that right. Right-handers actually scored statistically higher on the alternate uses test, that key measure of idea generation we talked about.
That's wild.
It is. And this surprising finding was largely driven by a massive study by Zickert and colleagues in 2018, which had thousands of participants, so it carried a lot of statistical weight. Interestingly, though, it wasn't the strongest right-handers with the highest scores.
Oh.
It was actually moderately right-handed individuals, which suggests maybe there's a nuance there about the degree of handedness, perhaps some kind of sweet spot, not extreme right-handedness.
Huh. But there was an exception you mentioned, something about drawing.
Ah, yes. There was one interesting exception, and it's important to unpack it. Left-handers did show a slight advantage, specifically on the figural, the drawing-based portion of the Torrance test, that part where you complete drawings.
Okay, so a definite little win for the lefties in the drawing part. That seems to fit the stereotype, the artistic lefty idea. But did the authors see that as proof of a general creative advantage, or was there, another explanation?
Not really a general advantage, no. And this is where the nuance is absolutely crucial. The authors put forward a very compelling argument for this specific finding, one that really dissects the nature of that advantage. They propose that this slight edge on the figural test is likely due to differences in, say, visual spatial ability, or maybe just the simple mechanics of drawing with the left hand, not necessarily a general boost in creative thinking.
How so? Like the way they make marks is different.
Possibly. Think about it. Certain lines, curves, maybe even shading techniques might just be inherently easier or feel more natural to execute with the left hand. This could potentially lead to a drawing that just looks more original or fluid to a rater. So it could be more about motor control and spatial processing, not necessarily about generating fundamentally more novel ideas. And adding to that, they offer this fascinating speculation. Maybe right-handed raters, who are mostly used to seeing drawings by other right-handers, might unconsciously perceive left-handed drawings as more original simply because they look different from the typical right-handed forms they usually see.
Like a novelty effect.
Exactly. A subtle perceptual bias. And crucially, they found no similar advantage for left-handers in any of the verbal creativity tests, the ones involving language and abstract thought, not physical drawing,
Oh, okay.
which further supports the idea that this isn't some general creative boost, but something very specific, almost mechanical or perhaps perceptual, tied just to the act of drawing itself.
So it sounds like that slight drawing edge for lefties is probably more about how they draw, or maybe how their drawings are seen, rather than some deep, innate creative wellspring. That really clarifies it. But okay, if the lab tests aren't showing an innate creative advantage, why would scientists even think there should be one? Like, are there any plausible brain-based reasons, any mechanisms that could hypothetically link handedness to creativity, even if this big meta-analysis didn't find strong evidence for it?
That's a crucial point, because the idea didn't come from nowhere. Morgan and his colleagues did explore two prominent theories about creativity in the brain that could offer a potential explanation for such a link, if one existed. Now, these theories aren't necessarily disproven by the meta-analysis results. They're still plausible ideas about how creativity might work in general. But the specific idea that handedness consistently influences creativity through these mechanisms, that's what the overall data doesn't seem to support. But let's look at what those theoretical mechanisms would be, because they're pretty insightful about brain function.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah.
What are they?
The first one is the right hemisphere theory. This theory basically proposes that brain areas, mainly in the right hemisphere, are really critical for creative thinking, specifically through a process called coarse semantic coding.
Coarse semantic coding. What's that?
Okay, so simply put, your brain's associative cortex in the left hemisphere tends to represent concepts in very narrow, tightly linked semantic fields. Think of it like a laser focus, great for precision, logic, clear distinctions.
Right.
But the right hemisphere's associative cortex, it tends to represent distantly related concepts in broad, loosely overlapping fields. Think more like a wide-angle lens. It picks up on fainter connections, more distant associations that your left brain might just ignore. This is thought to help with those aha moments, the novel ideas you need for divergent thinking.
Okay, broader connections in the right hemisphere. How does handedness tie in?
Well, it builds on this older idea called overflow of neural activity from Kinsborn and Hicks back in '78. The concept is that habitual strong activity in one brain region can kind of spill over and boost activity in nearby areas that are functionally related.
Ah, okay.
So since left-handed people habitually activate motor areas on the right side of their brain whenever they do things with their left hand, writing, eating, whatever.
Right, because motor control is contralateral.
Exactly. This consistent activation could, in theory, cause a spillover effect. It could stimulate those nearby right hemisphere areas that support this coarse semantic coding.
So over time, this could lead to like a habitual facilitation, almost a constant low-level priming of those creative right hemisphere areas for left-handers, giving them an edge.
That's the theoretical idea, yes. A sort of chronic enhancement through habitual motor activity.
I remember reading about a study at Goldstein, maybe, where people squeezed a ball with their left hand for a few minutes and actually did better on divergent thinking tests right after. That seems like a temporary proof of concept for that overflow idea, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It serves as a compelling, though temporary proof of concept for the overflow mechanism itself. It shows that manipulating activity in one hemisphere can indeed influence creative thinking, which makes the theoretical link neurologically plausible.
Okay.
The mechanism itself isn't necessarily wrong. It's just that the habitual long-term effect from just being left-handed doesn't seem to consistently show up as a measurable advantage in the big picture of the meta-analysis data. The temporary effect might not translate to a stable, real-world advantage.
Yeah, so what's the second theory?
The second major theory is the interhemispheric transfer theory. This one suggests that creativity relies heavily on efficient communication between the two hemispheres.
Okay, the connection between left and right brain.
Exactly. Because each hemisphere tends to specialize. Right, left, usually more language, logic, sequence. Right, more visuospatial, holistic, emotion. To make truly creative leaps, connecting distantly related ideas, synthesizing different kinds of information into something new, you need really good, fast communication across these specialized areas.
And the corpus callosum is key there.
Precisely. That thick bundle of nerve fibers connecting the hemispheres is the main highway for this communication. Now, the proposed link to handedness here is that left-handers tend to show more diffuse functional brain lateralization.
That's a mouthful. What does it mean?
It basically means that brain functions like language or visuospatial processing are less strictly confined to just one hemisphere. Often, these functions are more bilateral, spread across both sides more evenly than in typical right-handers.
So if functions are spread out more, that could logically lead to more communication between the hemispheres, right? because the brain constantly needs to integrate stuff across the midline if functions aren't neatly separated on one side. I've even heard speculation, anatomically, that left-handers might have thicker corpus callosum, that main connection, which would physically support better transfer. Though I know more recent analyses have kind of questioned that specific anatomical difference.
You're absolutely right to bring that up. That anatomical claim about a consistently thicker corpus callosum in left-handers has largely been challenged by more recent, larger meta-analyses. It doesn't seem to be a reliable structural difference across the board.
Okay.
However, even without a consistent physical difference in the corpus callosum size, the theory still holds that left-handers' systematic differences in motor experiences could lead to differing amounts of functional interhemispheric transfer. Think about it. In most right-handers, both language and dominant hand motor control are typically lateralized together in the left hemisphere. But in many left-handers, these functions might be in different hemispheres, meaning their brains constantly have to integrate information across the midline just for everyday tasks, like writing while thinking or coordinating speech and action. This constant habitual integration could foster greater functional connectivity over development.
That makes sense. More practice integrating.
And this theory often puts a special focus on mixed-handers, or ambidextrous folks. They routinely use both hands for fine motor tasks, especially in things that require coordinated use of both hands, like playing piano, typing, certain sports. This constant, balanced use of both hands could certainly foster increased hemispheric connectivity and communication over development, potentially giving them an edge in tasks requiring interhemispheric transfer.
Okay, so just to sum up these two theories. The right hemisphere, one with its coarse semantic coding, and the interhemispheric transfer, one focused on better communication between sides both, could provide a pretty solid theoretical reason for why left-handedness might be linked to creativity. The core idea seems to be that just the simple, lifelong difference in motor experience using your left hand more could subtly shape brain activity and connections in a way that boosts creative potential. It's just that the actual data, the empirical evidence from the lab tests and the meta-analysis, doesn't seem to consistently show that theoretical potential panning out.
Exactly. The mechanisms themselves are intellectually plausible, they make neurological sense on paper, but the observable outcome, that consistent measurable creative advantage in the lab, just isn't showing up strongly in the aggregated data. Which leads us neatly to the next critical piece of the puzzle. What about the real world? What about professions? If there's no clear innate advantage popping up in controlled lab settings, do left-handers at least tend to gravitate towards creative careers out there in the messy reality of the job market? Is the stereotype maybe powerful enough to become a self-fulfilling prophecy when it comes to choosing a career?
Right, because even if you don't score higher on some lab test, maybe that creative lefty image is strong enough to nudge people into those fields anyway, or maybe those fields just naturally attract people with certain motor skills or preferences. So what did the meta-analysis find about overrepresentation in those specific artistic fields, the ones we immediately think of, like art and music?
Well, this is where it gets interesting, because the meta-analysis did find a slight, but statistically notable, overrepresentation of both left and mixed-handers in certain specific creative fields that really align with that public perception. For art, for instance, they found an odds ratio, or OR, of 1.31 for left-handers, and for mixed-handers, it was even higher, 1.84.
Okay, what does that odds ratio mean, simply?
Simply put, it means left-handers were about 31% more likely, and mixed-handers a significant 84% more likely to be found in art-related jobs compared to right-handers or control groups.
Yeah.
It's a way of measuring how much more probable it is to find someone with that handedness in that specific field.
Got it. And music?
Similar story for music. The OR was 1.32 for left-handers and 1.42 for mixed-handers. So yeah, the stereotype isn't entirely pulled out of thin air when it comes to these two specific, very visible artistic domains. There is something there.
But why? If it's not necessarily innate general creativity, what's the explanation for that specific overrepresentation in art and music?
Well, researchers like Chrisman speculated back in '93, especially regarding music, that it might be linked to playing bimanually integrated instruments.
Bimanually integrated?
Yeah, instruments that demand really coordinated, often quite different, skillful use of both hands simultaneously. Think string instruments like violins or cellos, or woodwinds like clarinets or flutes.
Right. Each hand is doing something very different but coordinated.
Exactly. And since mixed-handers, by definition, are more adept at using both hands, and since left-handers as a group tend to show more mixed-handedness than the general population,
Ah, okay.
it could explain why they might gravitate towards or maybe excel in these specific musical areas. So again, it might not be about some general abstract creative spark, but rather a specific affinity or aptitude linked to fine motor control and that bimanual coordination skill. It's a more nuanced explanation than just lefties are creative.
That makes a lot of sense. It's less about broad creativity and more about a specific skill set or motor preference fitting the demands of the instrument. Very interesting. And what about architecture? That's another field often tossed into the creative lefty bucket, maybe because it mixes art and technical drawing. Did the data back that one up?
Nope. Despite that popular belief, which often lumps architects in with the creative lefties, the meta-analysis found no significant overrepresentation of either left or mixed-handers in architecture.
Really? Okay, so another stereotype bites the dust there.
Pretty much. It shows how even connections that seem intuitive can be debunked when you look at the broad data. So while we see these interesting specific exceptions in art and music, it's really crucial to pull back and look at the much bigger picture. When you consider creative professions overall, the findings are starkly different, and they deliver a really substantial, maybe even shocking blow to that general creative lefty myth.
Uh-oh. How so?
The key evidence here comes from a truly massive, large-scale analysis by Goodman in 2014. This study was huge. It covered over 11,700 participants across an amazing 771 different professions.
Wow, 771 professions.
Yeah, and Goodman didn't rely on subjective opinions about which jobs are creative. He used the U.S. Department of Labor's ONET Creativity Index. This is a standardized, objective rating system based on actual job analysis, combining measures of originality and inductive reasoning required for each occupation.
So an unbiased rating across a huge range of jobs.
Exactly. From artists to scientists to plumbers to CEOs, a really comprehensive rating of the creativity demands of each job.
And what was the surprising finding there, using this robust, objective measure? Because it sounds like this might completely flip the script on lefties in the workforce.
It absolutely does. Goodman found that, on average, the occupations held by left-handers actually required less originality and inductive reasoning than the occupations held by right-handers.
Less, not more.
Less. It's a stark, almost ironic contrast to that popular narrative of the universally creative lefty. It strongly suggests that on a broad societal level, left-handers are not, on average, ending up in or maybe excelling in the jobs that demand the very highest levels of creative thinking.
Wow, what kind of jobs are at the top of that Monet Creativity Index? What are we talking about?
We're talking about highly intellectually demanding fields, things like physicists, mathematicians, and also fine artists, which Wen breaks down into illustrators, sculptors, painters. These are professions that explicitly require high levels of original thought, abstract problem solving, novel idea generation.
Okay, so the clear, sweeping result from this huge, unbiased analysis is left-handers were actually underrepresented in the most highly creative jobs overall.
That's the finding. Underrepresented in the top tier. And conversely, right-handers were more likely to be found in those occupations, demanded the greatest creativity according to ONET.
And you mentioned left-handers were more likely to be in manual labor.
Yes. The Goodman analysis also indicated that left-handers were somewhat more likely to be found in manual labor occupations, which, while absolutely essential and valuable, are not typically categorized by high demands for originality or inductive reasoning in the ONET framework.
So what does this all mean for the broad, creative lefty myth? It just completely contradicts it head-on, doesn't it?
It undeniably and comprehensively contradicts the broad myth, yes. The evidence suggests that while there might be this slight overrepresentation in specific highly visible artistic fields like art and music, probably due to those nuanced factors like bimanual coordination or maybe social channeling,
Right.
there is no general innate creative advantage for left-handers. And even more starkly, there's certainly no overall overrepresentation in creative professions when you look at the whole job market objectively. In fact, the trend goes the other way, which leads us to this fascinating social and psychological question. If the science is so clear on this, why does the myth persist so damn strongly? Even in the face of all this contrary evidence, what keeps this narrative alive?
This raises such an important question, right? It really gets to the heart of how myths take root in our culture. If the creative advantage isn't innate, and if lefties are actually underrepresented in the most creative jobs overall, why on earth does this myth of the creative lefty stick around so powerfully in our minds, in the media? It's a real paradox.
It truly is. And William Weaver, in The Sinister Myth, he poses this really compelling editorial question that hits this exact paradox. Could the belief itself actually be shaping reality? Think back to the history we discussed. For centuries, left-handedness was sinister, right? A bad omen leading to stigma, forced hand switching, even punishment in schools.
Yeah, awful stuff.
Now, in modern times, maybe as a kind of cultural compensation, maybe that restorative justice idea we talked about. Maybe left-handed kids are now often labeled or perceived, consciously or not, as creative and gifted from a young age.
Ah, flipping the script.
Exactly. And that positive social encouragement, it can be incredibly powerful. If you're consistently told you're creative, or if society, maybe your parents, your teachers, subtly or not so subtly pushes you towards creative outlets like art classes, music lessons, imaginative play.
You're more likely to do them.
You're far more likely to develop those skills, invest time in them, and maybe ultimately pursue those paths. This social channeling, this constant reinforcement of a positive stereotype, could act as a really powerful self-fulfilling prophecy.
That makes perfect sense.
And this hypothesis could neatly explain why left-handers do seem overrepresented in those specific, visible fields like art and music, even while they're broadly underrepresented across all creative professions. The story we tell about left-handers, the expectations we project, might just be more powerful in shaping their choices than any underlying neurological truth.
So it's less about innate brain wiring for creativity and more about how society reacts to that difference, or even just the perception of it, and then shapes opportunities and self-image.
Wow. Beyond that, what about personality? Do people believe left-handers have certain personality traits that help creativity? And is there any truth to those beliefs?
That's definitely another layer contributing to the myth's persistence. People certainly tend to believe left-handers have traits often linked to creativity, like being nonconformist, maybe more open-minded, perhaps a bit unconventional. And some studies have found some limited evidence that seems to support these perceptions. For instance, Kreisman back in 2014 found that mixed-handers showed higher sensation-seeking, lower authoritarianism, and even a lower sense of disgust. Interesting traits. How might they relate?
Well, sensation-seeking and lower authoritarianism could plausibly link to a preference for novelty, maybe rule-breaking, nonconformity things, often stereotypically associated with fields like art and music, where pushing boundaries is valued. Chrisman has also found in 2013 that mixed-handers were more likely to prefer unpopular music genres, again reinforcing that sort of rebellious or unique image. And another study, Bryson et al. In 2009, noted a correlation between the degree of left-handedness and intellectual openness, which is a personality trait generally known to correlate with divergent thinking. So you can see these threads that seem to support the perception.
Okay, so some threads there, but then crucially, what's the counter evidence? Because stereotypes, as we know, often paint with a very broad brush and don't always match reality. Do these perceived personality differences hold up consistently under wider scrutiny?
You're absolutely right to push on that, because despite these perceptions and some of those isolated findings, other large, robust studies like those by Grimshaw and Wilson in 2013 and Kilgore et al.
Yeah.
Back in 1999 found no significant difference in actual openness to experience or other key personality traits between left and right-handers overall.
No difference.
No consistent, significant difference when looking at large populations. So while people believe left-handers are more open, more nonconformist, maybe more introverted, the empirical evidence for these being consistent personality differences across the whole group just doesn't hold up strongly.
So the stereotype is stronger than the reality.
It really highlights how powerful and pervasive stereotypes can be, doesn't it? Often outweighing the complex reality in the public mind. We want to believe the stereotype, maybe, so we kind of see it, even when the broad data doesn't consistently back it up.
Okay. Is there anything else keeping this myth alive?
Well, there's one more speculative and maybe slightly darker reason Weaver touches on. It ties into that deeply ingrained cultural trope, the idea of the tortured artist.
Ah, the genius linked with suffering.
Exactly, as Schlesinger described it in 2009. This romanticized yet often tragic idea links creative brilliance with mental health, struggles the notion that genius comes at a psychological price. This trope then gets matched together with the popular perception, accurate or not, that left-handers have a higher likelihood of experiencing mental health issues.
Okay, so what is the actual science on handedness and mental health? Is there a kernel of truth to that popular belief about left-handers and psychopathology, or is that another broad misinterpretation fueling the myth?
There is a kernel of truth, but like the personality stuff, it's much more specific and nuanced than the popular belief usually allows. Large studies and meta-analyses, like recent ones by Mundorf et al. Or Herrnstein et al., do suggest that mixed-handers, again, those without a strong hand preference, show an increased prevalence of certain mood disorders, including depression and also conditions like schizophrenia.
Mixed-hander specifically.
The evidence seems stronger for mixed-handers than for consistently left-handed individuals, generally speaking. However, in popular belief, that distinction often gets blurred. Left-handers and mixed-handers both might get lumped together as being at greater risk for general psychopathology.
Right.
And this generalized perception then kind of reinforces older cultural biases that any non-right-handedness is somehow different or maybe even pathological in some vague way.
So how does this connect back to creativity and the tortured artist idea?
While connecting it back, some researchers have theoretically suggested that certain mental illnesses, particularly maybe conditions like bipolar disorder, could in principle lead to increased creative output.
How?
The idea might be that these conditions could maybe temporarily disrupt typical prefrontal cortex regulation or conventional thought patterns, which could in turn maybe facilitate the generation of unconventional, out there, but sometimes brilliant ideas. And historically, some anecdotal or biographical studies of famous creative artists by people like Andreessen, Jameson, Ludwig have reported higher rates of mental illness among them, which seems to give some credence to that tortured artist trope.
But those historical studies, as I understand it, are often based on pretty small samples, maybe retrospective biographical data, which makes them vulnerable to confirmation bias. You find what you're looking for. What do bigger, more robust population-level studies say about the actual link between mental illness and creativity? And how does that tie back to handedness?
Excellent point. Methodology is absolutely key here. Large-scale Swedish census studies by Kiaga and colleagues in 2011 and 2013 offer a much more robust, less biased look at these connections. They found that bipolar disorder was indeed overrepresented in creative professions, lending some solid support to the tortured artist idea for that specific condition.
Okay, so a link for bipolar. What about schizophrenia?
Their findings on schizophrenia were more complex, less clear-cut. While the 2011 study initially suggested schizophrenia was overrepresented in specifically artistic creative professions, their larger, more comprehensive 2013 study found that people with schizophrenia were actually underrepresented when you considered all creative professions across the board. So the picture is far from simple, definitely not consistently positive.
Right.
So let's connect this back to handedness now. Since mixed-handers seem linked more strongly to schizophrenia, and the link between handedness and bipolar disorder is less clear or consistent, and it's bipolar disorder that has the most consistent link with overall creativity in these big studies. Then there's no strong empirical evidence that left-handers, or even mixed-handers, exhibit the specific types of psychopathology most robustly associated with enhanced creativity across professions. However, the popular belief that left-handers have generally higher rates of psychopathology, combined with that pervasive tortured artist trope, probably does fuel the mistaken belief that left-handers should therefore be more creative. It's like a faulty chain of reasoning built on popular misinterpretations and ingrained stereotypes, rather than a factual, empirical connection.
Wow. Okay, so after digging through all of this, the linguistic history, the lab tests, the real-world jobs, the personality stuff, the mental health links, what's the decisive conclusion? What is the ambidextrous truth here? And how does science, in this case, really act as a crucial corrective against these deeply held popular beliefs?
The decisive conclusion is really clear and, yeah, for many people, probably quite surprising. The widely accepted idea that being left-handed gives you an innate creative advantage is basically a myth.
Just a myth.
It's a powerful and pervasive cultural narrative, absolutely. One that's been repeated in popular media, even some older scientific literature for years. But it's just not supported by the robust body of empirical evidence, especially when you look at these large-scale meta-analyses. The data really points us away from some inherent neurological link between the hand you write with and your creative genius. And the work of Morgan, Zhao, and Casasanto, and the detailed analysis presented in Weaver's The Sinister myth, it really exemplifies science's crucial corrective mechanism in action, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does.
They took this widely accepted truth, this common cultural assumption, and they subjected it to rigorous evidence-based scrutiny through that comprehensive meta-analysis. And that process helps us move beyond anecdotes, personal biases, comfortable cultural stories, towards a more factual, data-driven understanding of the world. It's how science helps refine our knowledge, even when, maybe especially when, it challenges beliefs we hold dear.
And what's truly fascinating here, I think, beyond just debunking a myth, is that While the intricate neurological basis of creativity itself remains this exciting, ongoing area in study, like how the brain actually generates novel ideas, is still a huge mystery.
Oh, absolutely.
The data seems consistently clear that the hand you write with, whether it's left or right, simply has no bearing on your innate, fundamental creative potential. It really disentangles those two concepts completely.
Exactly. And this brings us right back around to that fascinating question of why the myth persists, which is maybe the most profound takeaway here. It's ironic, isn't it? But the idea of the creative lefty may be born from that historical need to balance centuries of negativity, or maybe just our basic human need to craft appealing stories about difference. That idea might be powerful enough, ironically, to shape the paths people actually choose to pursue.
The self-fulfilling prophecy again.
Right. The belief itself, rather than any inherent neurological difference, can influence career choices, self-perception, even how others see an individual's potential. It just highlights how incredibly powerful social narratives can be, profoundly influencing individual lives and societal trends, even if the underlying biological basis isn't actually there. It's a real testament to the power of belief over biology, in a way.
Before we wrap up this deep dive, though, it's always important, I think, to acknowledge that no scientific study is perfect. Even the most comprehensive meta-analyses have limitations, nuances. What were some of the caveats that Morgan and his colleagues mentioned in their work, just to give listeners the full picture of the scientific rigor and context?
That's an excellent and crucial point for context. First, they did acknowledge that some of their meta-analytic pools, especially for those divergent thinking tests, included a relatively small number of studies. So some pools had fewer than 5 studies.
Okay. And what's the risk there?
Well, while they tried to mitigate this by including unpublished work like theses, what's called gray literature, smaller pools always increase the risk of what scientists call a type 2 error. Simply put, that means they might have missed a real but subtle effect, an invisible advantage that was just too small to detect reliably with limited data, especially if it was a very tiny advantage.
So interpret those specific null results with a bit of caution.
Exactly. Interpret those specific null results cautiously and always in light of the overall, much broader pattern across all the tests and data. They also discuss the issue of publication bias, which is always a potential concern in meta-analyses.
Right, the idea that studies finding exciting positive results get published more easily.
Precisely. In many fields, studies finding something positive, like, hey, left-handers are more creative, might be more likely to get published than studies finding no difference. Now, while publication bias is hard to quantify perfectly with small samples, if it were present here, it would actually likely favor finding false positives for left-hander creativity.
Ah, so it would push things towards finding an advantage.
Exactly. So the fact that they largely found null results, or even that slight right-handed advantage, actually works against the typical direction you'd expect from publication bias, which, counterintuitively, can actually strengthen their overall conclusions. It suggests the absence of an advantage isn't just because positive results weren't published.
That's a neat point. And you mentioned earlier this idea of double-dipping bias when looking at creative professions in older studies. Can you elaborate on how that could skew things and why that Goodman study was so important?
Certainly. The researchers noted this potential double-dipping bias. What often happened in the past is that researchers would specifically pick fields like art, music, architecture, precisely because those fields already had anecdotal claims or maybe some limited prior studies suggesting links with handedness.
So they were selecting fields already thought to be linked.
Right. And that selection method could inadvertently inflate the perceived overrepresentation of left-handers in those specific fields, creating a potentially false impression of a broader, general link to creativity across all professions.
Okay.
This is exactly why that huge, unbiased Goodman study from 2014 is so critical. It looked at 771 professions across the board using objective criteria, without pre-selecting based on prior handedness claims. It avoids that inherent selection bias and gives a much more accurate picture of the whole professional landscape.
Makes sense. Any other limitations?
Just briefly, while Morgan et al. Didn't perform every possible formal, checklist-based risk of bias analysis, like using tools called NS or ROB2, they did state that the definitions of handedness used in the studies they included were generally straightforward and pretty consistent. And while population differences across studies could theoretically influence results, maybe varying levels of social stigma against lefties across cultures or times, almost all the studies they included were from North American samples collected after the mid-20th century. This suggests generally comparable levels of social stigma during those study periods, meaning population differences probably weren't systematically messing up their findings.
Okay.
So yes, these limitations are present, the authors acknowledge them, but they don't seem to undermine the overall strength and consistency of their main conclusions. They really provide a comprehensive and, I think, trustworthy debunking of the myth.
So, what does this all mean for you, our listener? Whether you're left-handed, right-handed, or maybe somewhere in between mixed-handed. The overarching takeaway seems really clear. While left-handers have definitely faced significant historical prejudice, and maybe they do feel a powerful cultural pull towards creative fields, perhaps as that compensation for past wrongs, or maybe due to specific motor aptitudes fitting certain fields like music,
Hmm.
the actual scientific evidence just doesn't support an innate, inherent creative advantage based solely on which hand you prefer to use. Your capacity for original thought, for imaginative problem solving, it really isn't dictated by your dominant hand.
Indeed. And this leads us to, I think, a truly provocative final thought for you to chew on. Given how powerfully a pervasive myth like this one about the creative lefty can shape individual paths, our aspirations, even how we see ourselves, even when faced with strong scientific evidence challenging it, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other conventional absurdities, what other widely accepted ideas might we be unknowingly living by?
Hmm.
Well, maybe it's the idea that early specialization in careers is always best, or that extroverts are inherently better leaders, or even that certain foods are universally bad, despite more nuanced scientific data. The world is full of these compelling narratives, right? Deeply woven into our culture. And our deep dive today really shows the profound power and importance of critically examining them. How might these widely accepted yet perhaps unproven beliefs, these assumptions we rarely question, be influencing your own choices right now, your perceptions of yourself, and how you view the potential and traits of others around you?
A truly fascinating thought to ponder, and one that resonates deeply with what we try to do here. We really encourage you to reflect on how beliefs, both the true ones and the false ones, can impact our personal stories and our societal narratives. Always try to approach those widely accepted truths with a curious, critical mind, and maybe the courage to seek out the actual data. And of course, keep exploring with us right here on the Deep Dive.